Hi, welcome to today's video. My name is Paul. So this week I'm going to touch a little bit on the ideas of color theory, or sort of my interpretation of those and my opinions about those sort of things. A couple of weeks ago I did a video on painting without color, black and white, monochrome, that type of thing. So this week is kind of going in the opposite direction, adding in a bit of color. Color is, well, there's lots of different ways of looking at it, I suppose. One way is it's just another degree of freedom that we have as artists, and we can explore this idea of color and using color. And that's where the whole sort of color theory thing comes in, and it can, like a lot of these things, it can start to get very complicated very quickly, especially when it comes to mixing colors, mixing paint. I don't do that. Not because I'm trying to be different, but I got started into sort of what's sometimes called fine art through soft pastels, or some people call them dry pastels or chalk pastels, whatever you want to call them. You can see some of them on the screen around this little drawing that I'm doing. The thing about dry pastels is you don't mix colors, so it's not like liquid paints, oil or acrylic, gouache, watercolor. You can mix those. You can start off with the primary colors and mix them and get your secondary and tertiary colors and so on. Soft pastels, you don't do that. You can't really mix so much. So that's why people who work with soft pastels often have boxes and boxes of different colored pastels. And you can see a little bit of that around the side of the screen. So next thing we're going to look at is one of the sort of key ideas in color theory is the idea of the color wheel. Okay, so tiny little bit of history about this idea of the color wheel. It's not new, it's been around for a long time, at least going back to, say, the 17th century. The English scientist Isaac Newton, as far as I can tell, was one of the first people to create a color wheel. Now, of course, he wasn't interested in the color wheel in the way that artists would be. He wasn't an artist, he was a scientist. He was trying to understand the nature of color, the nature of light, and how our eyes and brains perceive those things. At that time, people still didn't really know what color was, for example, or even what light was, how it worked. Those are the sort of things, sort of questions that Isaac Newton was trying to find answers to. At some point, I don't know when, artists picked up on this idea of a color wheel and started using it for various purposes, I guess. As I said, I don't really use it. I know it exists, I know what it is, but it's not really of that much interest to me. As I said, I don't really do color mixing. I use paint almost straight from the tube. Even when I'm using liquid paint, I don't do any mixing. So even when I'm doing watercolor painting, the only mixing that happens is on the paper, by accident, by chance. It's not deliberate. But I guess the color wheel is useful to some artists. As well as thinking about mixing colors, I guess the other thing is choosing a color palette. Some people maybe use it for those sort of ideas. There are other ways, though, to think about color. The rest of the video there, I'm going to share some of these ideas. This is sort of the way that I think about color, rather than just, if I mix A and B, I get C. Slightly different ways of thinking about color and how to use color in painting. So on screen you can see two drawings. The one on the left is just grayscale. The one on the right has a tiny little bit of color in there. To me, color is just another dimension, another degree of freedom, if you like, that artists can explore and experiment with. That's the positive side. On the negative side, if you like, the con, when you add in color, you're adding in complexity. It's one more thing that you have to think about. It's one more thing that you have to learn about when you're getting into art. But it certainly does open up new possibilities and new ways of experimenting. So, how to think about color? One of the ways I think about it is in terms of the proportions of color. So not just the actual colors you're using, but also what proportion are you using those colors in? So is your painting dominated by blue, for example? This painting, you can see one of my older watercolor paintings. It's dominated by blue and green. So the way I tried to demonstrate this was using an app called TinEye. Strange name, but there you go. I'll try and remember to put a description or a link in the description box below if anybody's interested. It's based on this AI. No, it's not fantastic. It's quite simplistic in the way it works, but it takes the original image. You can see it on the left of the screen. It simplifies it, simplifies the colors used, and then tells you what proportion those colors are in. The only reason I'm using it is to try and demonstrate that in this painting, the blue really dominates. Almost half of the color is that sort of light bluish gray. So that's one way of thinking about color. What proportions am I using my colors in? So if I have 4 or 5 colors in the painting, is it dominated by one color? Is it more evenly spread between all 5 colors? That type of idea. Another example, this time sort of greens and grayish greens, but it's not dominated by any one color. The most common color, the most prevalent color in the painting is about 26%, so about a quarter of the painting instead of closer to half the painting. So it's simplistic, this app, and what it can do, but it just demonstrates this idea that don't just think about mixing the colors or the color scheme that you're using, but also what proportion are you going to use the colors in. Is one color going to dominate, or are you going to have a more balanced distribution of color? It's an interesting thing to play around with and to experiment with. Again, there's no right or wrong answers as to which one is best. It's up to you. Experiment, find out which ones you like, which ones work for you. Another way of thinking about color is, again, not just color schemes or which color is dominant, but also how important or how much emphasis do you put on color within your painting. So on the right hand side is one of my older sort of impressionist style watercolor paintings. Now if you think about impressionism, one of the things that is associated with impressionism is the use of color. Impressionist paintings are colorful, so you can't really imagine a black and white impressionist painting. Would it even be an impressionist painting if you took away the color? Color is certainly central, I think, to the whole idea of impressionism. So painting on the right, color is very important. It's the main part, it's like the core of the painting is the use of color, but it doesn't have to be. On the left hand side you can see a drawing, charcoal drawing. There is color in there. It's not immediately obvious and it's very, very subtle, but there is a bit of blue in there. In the sort of distant hills there's a touch of blue. In the sky it's maybe not obvious on the screen, but in real life you can see there's a little bit of blue in the sky, and there's a few little dots of blue in the foreground. So this time we're thinking about how much color we're going to use. Is color going to be at the core of the whole painting, to be essential in the painting, or is it just something, it's a subtle thing that's sort of there but it's not in your face kind of thing? Another way of thinking about color is the idea of using local color, or if you like, representational color. So by local color, I mean the colors that we often associate with elements within, say, a landscape. So if you were to sit down with a 7 or 8-year-old child and ask them, what color is the sky? They'd probably say blue. That's local color. It's the color that we often associate with an element, say within a landscape. So the grass is green, the sky is blue. If you change that, if you swap around so that you put a green sky and blue grass, the thing about that is you're putting more of a demand on the viewer. You're not just spoon feeding the person looking at your art. You're requiring them to do a little bit of work and figure out what's going on. So that can be an interesting way of using color, to use it in a non-representational way. Now, if you do that, you're going to lose some support, if you like, because some people don't like to work. They want to be spoon-fed. They just want a pretty picture they can look at and go, oh, that's nice. And that's it. They don't want to have to work to understand what might be going on, or to have any sort of emotional response beyond, oh, that's a pretty picture. So if you're going to demand things of the viewer, of your art, you will get criticism. You will get people saying, what's that supposed to be? Why don't you just do it the way it's supposed to be? Those are all things that I've heard in the past. But again, it's an interesting experiment that you can do, using color in a non-representational way, perhaps in a aesthetic way, or perhaps you're trying to get the viewer to think a little bit more about what they're looking at. But anyway, those are some ways that I think are maybe interesting, and maybe even more interesting than just the basic, if I mix A plus B, I get C, which is the way a lot of textbooks deal with color. But I think there's more to it, and there's different ways of thinking about it. And ultimately, if you think about these things, I think it makes art a bit more interesting as well, both from the point of view of looking at art and also the point of view of making art. Okay, well, if you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching and listening, and hopefully see you again in next week's video.